Happy Triple Header Thursday, everyone. We've got videos coming out on all 3 channels today, so make sure to subscribe now to JG8 and JG7 to learn more about the history of college football and the history of Major League Baseball. And now, on with our feature presentation. When you think of a typical NFL afternoon on a Sunday, what do you think of? Well, in all likelihood, you think of a network broadcasting a game in the early window at 1 o'clock Eastern, and then broadcasting a game in the late window at 4 o'clock Eastern. You think of 7 hours of entirely too many commercials football, but you think of each network being on the air for the entire time, right? Even if you might not get CBS for both the early and the late window, and might only get one game or the other if it's a single header, James Brown and Company are on for all 7 hours. Even if you might not get Fox for both the early and the late window, and might only get one game or the other if it's a single header, Kurt Menefee and Company are on for all 7 hours. Barring some extremely rare circumstances where it's entirely by design, like a national doubleheader for the network where it's intentional that only one game is on, or something else preempting coverage, like in 2020 when CBS televised the final round of the Masters that got pushed back because of COVID, meaning that there were no early games in the window, CBS and Fox are, at least somewhere in the country, on air for the entire football afternoon. Which is what makes this story all the more bizarre. Because this game right here that you've been watching the whole time is a 1988 battle between the San Diego Chargers and the Miami Dolphins. And the broadcasting story behind this game is ridiculous, to the point where you had to wonder what the schedule makers were on when they came up with the schedule. Because this game was never supposed to be played at the time slot that it was played at. Turns out, it got moved at the last minute because, and I kid you not, the NFL forgot how the schedule worked, and quite simply, forgot to schedule a late game. Seriously. And we're going to take a deep dive into that mess today. Because this is the story behind what has to be the dumbest scheduling and broadcasting controversy of the entire 1988 season. Before I talk about the actual incident in question and the complete ineptitude on the part of the NFL here, we need some context to understand the importance of the game at hand, as well as what the original plan was for the NFL on this day, and how NFL scheduling rules worked. It's October 16, 1988. It's week 7 of the NFL season, and as we're nearing the halfway point of the year, we have a big battle on our hands in the AFC between the Miami Dolphins and the San Diego Chargers. This was a pretty big game for both teams, who were slow to come out of the gates to start off the season. For the Dolphins, they entered this one at 3-3, thanks to an unusually anemic offense that was averaging just 16 points per game, and ranked 23rd in the NFL out of 28 teams. You never hear that about a Dan Marino-led offense, so to say that is utterly shocking. And for the Chargers, they entered this one at 2-4, boasting the worst offense in the NFL, as they had scored just 74 points all year, coming out to just over 12 points per game, and boasting the 3rd worst point differential in the NFL at -48, only besting the Atlanta Falcons and the New England Patriots in that category. Both of these teams absolutely needed this game to stay alive in the playoff picture. Both teams entered the day 2 games back of their respective division leaders in the Buffalo Bills and the Seattle Seahawks. So a loss here to potentially drop to 3 games back would make things a real uphill climb to win the division crown. And with both teams on the outside looking in of the wildcard picture if the season ended today, a loss here would also make things pretty difficult going forward, as they would have very little, if any, room for error over the second half of the season or so. And this absolutely critical battle between 2 middling teams in the AFC fighting to break out of their early season doldrums was originally scheduled for 1 o'clock Eastern. It meant a return to normalcy of sorts for Miami, after they spent the previous 2 weeks with games against the Minnesota Vikings and Los Angeles Raiders playing at 4 o'clock. And it meant an early day for San Diego, since they'd be playing at 10 o'clock in the morning Pacific time, meaning that Charger fans who wanted to watch this game would be doing so right after breakfast. In fact, this Dolphins-Chargers game was one of 10 games scheduled for the 1 o'clock Eastern slate. That's a lot of games at 1 o'clock, but somewhere in that ballpark was relatively typical and normal. Remember, there was no Sunday Night Football back then. There was no Thursday Night Football back then. You didn't have Thursday games unless it was Thanksgiving, or unless ABC had a special broadcast. And there were no bye weeks back then. The only primetime game was Monday Night Football, so while you had one game on then, you had to fit 13 others either at 1 o'clock or 4 o'clock. So a 10-3 split isn't anything that unusual for 1988. Which raises the question, what were the 3 games taking place at the 4 o'clock window? If I was a Dolphins or a Chargers fan, and I was planning my day around watching my team play, what would my options be afterwards? Well, one of the games was the interconference battle at Mile High Stadium between the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons. You've got the 2-time defending AFC champion riding a 2-game winning streak, going up against arguably the worst team in football, as they were 1-5 and coming off of a shutout 33-0 loss the previous week at home to the Los Angeles Rams. Okay, not the best game, especially since the Broncos were favored by 13 points, and everyone predicting a blowout was 100% right, as even though it was a tied game at the half, Denver pulled away in the final 2 quarters of action and won it by 3 possessions, taking it by a final score of 30-14. Option 2 was the interconference battle between the New Orleans Saints and the Seattle Seahawks at the Kingdome. Alright, now we're talking. On paper, this looks like it could be one of the best games of the young season. You've got 2 teams that made the playoffs the previous year and are picking up right where they left off in 1988. The Seahawks are 4-2, lead the AFC West, and have won 2 straight, while the Saints are 5-1 and tied for the NFC West lead thanks to a 5-game winning streak and an offense in the top quarter of the league, averaging over 23 points per game. And this one turned out to be a good game, as the Saints won on the road and took it by a final score of 20-19. And then you've got option 3, which was the Big Kahuna. This was the broadcast with John Madden and Pat Summerall on the call, so you knew it was going to be good. Because this was the NFC West divisional rivalry between the San Francisco 49ers and the Los Angeles Rams. That's what I'm talking about. The 5-1 Rams with the top point differential in football at plus 72, and the top offense in football by averaging just under 30 points per game, against the 4-2 49ers, who need no introduction. This was for first place in the NFC West, so the stakes could not be higher. And this one turned out to be a great game too, as the 49ers won on a game-winning, 4th quarter touchdown run by Roger Craig from 16 yards out, as they defeated their in-state rival by a final score of 24-21. All things considered, this 4 o'clock late slate of games was looking awfully good. Only one of the teams playing was under 500, and you had a battle for divisional supremacy as the centerpiece. However, you might have noticed something with those aforementioned games. You might have noticed a teeny tiny problem that we need to talk about. Who are the road teams in all of those games? In the Broncos-Falcons game, it's the Falcons. In the Saints-Seahawks game, it's the Saints. In the 49ers-Rams game, it's the 49ers, but that doesn't matter. Point is, what do all 3 of those teams have in common? They all play in the NFC. And per NFL broadcasting rules, the network that is responsible for televising the game is the network of the road team. Since CBS owned the rights to the NFC television package, this meant that they had to divvy up, amongst its affiliates, all 3 games. And there was no cross-flexing back in 1988. That didn't come about until a quarter century later. So it was set in stone that with the exception of Monday Night Football and the Super Bowl, all games where an AFC team was on the road would be televised by NBC, and all games where an NFC team was on the road would be televised by CBS. And what does this mean? Well, it means that NBC, quite literally, did not have a game to air in that late window. They had games to air at 1 o'clock, It wasn't a ton of games considering the imbalance, but they had 4 options with the games between the Bengals and Patriots, the Oilers and Steelers, the Raiders and Chiefs, and the Chargers and Dolphins that you've been watching for reasons that will become incredibly apparent in just a little bit. But at 4 o'clock, they had absolutely nothing. And that was a problem, because per NFL broadcasting rules, there had to be continuous football coverage throughout the day, meaning that if you lived in the United States, you were guaranteed that football would be on some network from 1 o'clock Eastern until 7 o'clock Eastern. And if you were based in a market of a home NFL team, you only got 2 games on TV that day. As an example, the Packers and Vikings played at 1 o'clock in Minnesota on CBS. If you lived in Minnesota, this meant that you didn't get a CBS game at 4 o'clock. However, based on the continuous broadcast rule, and the fact that an opposing network wasn't exactly allowed to compete against a home team, this meant that at 4 o'clock, if you were in Minnesota, you had to get some sort of NFL broadcast, which by rule would have been an NBC broadcast. And that's a problem when, quite literally, there was no NBC broadcast to show. Blackout rules and broadcasting rules can be as fascinating as they are frustrating and confusing. So if you want to learn more about the intricacies of them and why this was the case, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, if you're confused, to make a long story short and to break it down into the simplest terms, about half the country, as things stood, was not going to get a 4 o'clock game or a late game of any kind. And the amazing part about all of this is that no one, not a single soul, caught this when the schedule was released. No one realized, hey, wait a second, there aren't any NBC games in the late window for Week 7. That could be a problem. No one stopped to think, wait, why are all the games in the late window for this week being broadcast by CBS? And it would be one thing if flex scheduling when it came to times existed, sort of like how it does today. However, back in 1988, all the times for games were set in stone. Whatever time the game was scheduled for at the start of the season, that was final. Unless there was a scheduling conflict that came up at the last minute, which was sometimes the case with teams in multi-purpose stadiums that share the venue with a Major League Baseball team making a playoff push, or something happened with the weather that forced the game to be moved up or back, the time was final. Which meant that the NFL and NBC and all the people responsible with the schedule and whatnot completely blanked and didn't realize until September, a few weeks away from Week 7, that, oh crap, we don't have a late game on NBC, and we kind of need one, because if we don't have one, there's a good chunk of the country that will only be able to watch a 1 o'clock game. The schedule for the 1988 season was released on April 5th. With all the people working in the league office and with NBC, they had plenty of time to figure this out and realize that this was an issue. But not only did no one catch the issue before the schedule came out, and not only did no one catch the issue shortly after the schedule was released, but it took officials until September 21st, a whole 170 days, to realize that something was off, and to do something about it. It took them half the year to look at a schedule and realize the problem. That is amazing. Which raises the question, what's the point of this Dolphins-Chargers game that you've been watching just about this whole time? Well, the NFL, once they finally realized the issue and came to their senses, decided to push the Dolphins-Chargers game from a 1 o'clock start to a 4 o'clock start. It made the most sense to push that game back, I suppose. It allowed Charger fans to watch at their normal time. It allowed for fans at the game to avoid the heat to some extent by playing as the sun was going down, although it was still 78 degrees at kickoff with 63% humidity, so much for that. And it allowed Florida, which was a hotly contested battle between the Dolphins and the Buccaneers, and was constantly in the middle of a ton of broadcasting disputes between the teams, to broadcast the Bucs game at 1 o'clock and the Dolphins game on NBC at 4 o'clock. But again, this was decided in mid-September, so long after the fact that all the tickets for the game said a 1 o'clock start time. I know this because you can buy a ticket for this game on eBay, and sure enough, on the ticket, it says a 1 o'clock start time. Just out of curiosity, for those who wonder what the back of the ticket looks like, here it is. Just your standard list of banned items and an advertisement for Burger King to buy. Oh God, we're not doing this again. No, we're not doing this again. No, turn it off. Well, that was a bad idea on my part. Very bad idea. Anyways, for what it's worth, if you couldn't tell from the highlights, when all was said and done in this one, the Dolphins emerged victorious, as they won by a final score of 31-28, erasing a 28-17 deficit after 3 quarters to score the final 14 points of the game on some goal line touchdown runs by Lorenzo Hampton and Troy Stratford, all while forcing 4 turnovers in the process during the second half, and keeping Dan Marino upright the whole game, as he didn't get sacked once. As a side note, this game was part of Marino's legendary streak, where he went more than 750 consecutive passing attempts without getting sacked. So if you want to learn more about that streak, click the card in the upper right corner. But as great as this game turned out to be, the whole story of how this game even got played in the first place is insane, and remains insane 35 years later. The NFL is run on television. The NFL is not the success and the juggernaut that it is without its ability to embrace TV and cooperate with television networks. And for them to just outright forget to schedule a late game because they didn't notice a problem with their schedule for half the year is insanely humorous. So for anyone at the league office in charge of crafting the schedule and sorting through the computer files until it puts out a schedule that looks good, a word of advice. Make sure that you have a late game scheduled on a given week. Don't forget the all-important 4 o'clock time slot, because in 1988 music terms, if that happens, you've got to make a change. You can't just be like Steve Winwood and roll with it. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.